Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Halverson, and today I'm really excited to come back with part 2 of our 3-part series on the Lazy S Ranch and the life of Colonel Slaughter. As you can see behind me, my studio is currently being torn down. We're actually in the middle of moving to a new house, so I apologize if there's been any delay in episodes, but we've got to get moved, and so it might be a little bit of time between episodes for the next couple, but really looking forward to hitting the ground running. I've got some ideas for other series, and of course going to continue with our current plans, but today, of course, we are focusing on part 2, which is the building, the developing, and the acquisition of the Lazy S Ranch by the Colonel and his family, and of course his pursuit of that American dream that we talked about. So really excited to get into today's episode and provide you guys with some more information about the Colonel. And I think that this episode's interesting if you're somebody who is fascinated by how these big ranches, think the 4-6s, the Wagner, the King Ranch, how did these come about? Because the Colonel was operating at around the same time as some of these folks. Of course, he was a good friend of Charles Goodnight, as we learned in the last episode, and it's really just a fascinating time in American history. If you'll notice, we're kind of establishing a golden age, if you will, a golden era of ranching, which happens between the late 1860s through the 1890s. That post-Civil War period when America was rebuilding in the East, but was exploding in growth in the West. So really excited to tell this story about the acquisition of the ranch, which ultimately ended up around 250,000 acres, and how the Colonel, if you will, figured out how to build that empire. So stick with me. We'll get it into the details right after a quick word from our sponsors. Thank you. Well, I'm proud to welcome the newest sponsor for the Rancher Podcast, and that is Elite Ranch Consulting. They are your one-stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you are already working, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can protect your American dream. Now, if you remember back to last week's episode, you'll know that Slaughter and his father and his brothers, had successfully been running cattle since the 1850s. But the Civil War had taken its toll. Young Slaughter was, having to operate and manage duties on the home front, if you will, and there really wasn't much productivity going on those days that was not directly related to the war. But interestingly enough, the reconstruction of the South and the rebuilding throughout the East really led to the Renaissance, the explosion in growth, if you will, in the Western United States. And that's where we find, as I mentioned in the intro to this episode, the golden age of ranching. Unfortunately, it does not end beautifully, because as people move in, ranches have to get smaller, they have to adapt. Things change, progress comes, of course, and with it becomes difficulties that you can't be the large giant property anymore. You have to adapt. So the story of Slaughter and building his ranch actually starts in earnest in 1876 near the modern day city of Colorado City, Texas. And if you want to know where this city is, you can either look on the map that I got showing here, or if you're just listening to the podcast, it's just west of Abilene on the Colorado River. And at this time, the Colonel had actually been living in Dallas. So today, this is a few hours trip west into the Texas, Balcones Escarpment, past that into the Llano Estacado. But at the time, it could be a few days worth of travel. So he had been building his family with his new wife, of course, in the mid-1870s. His first wife had passed away, and so he already had a pretty sizable family at this time, but was growing it almost into the double digits at this point. And, he had kind of settled into a more sedentary lifestyle. He knew that cattle driving was a young man's game, and that he was no longer a young man, of course, suffering injuries from his work, but also from the bullet on that expedition with Goodnight into Mexico. It was hard for him to sit abreast a saddle and ride the trails. So as you will recall, he had become very successful in the banking ventures in Dallas, and this was a great place for him to be. But he knew that although cattle driving was a young man's game, that the game was changing, and that cattle driving wasn't necessarily the future. You no longer needed to round up cattle and herd them north. You could stake a claim to pastures and build a ranch there, and then ship them via the new technology of railroads to markets that were much closer than Kansas. You could reach much further markets, and all of these things made it much easier for someone like Slaughter to get back into the business. But if Slum needed young men for his cattle driving and his ranches, he already had quite the growing brood at home as well. So he thought that this might be the best time to get back into the ranching game. So while Slaughter had really not ever gotten out of the cattle business completely, this period where he started moving cattle into Colorado City was kind of the rebirth of his starting in earnest on building this ranch that he thought could outlast him. And, initially he sent down 2,000 head of cattle in 1876, and then later on in 1877, with the help of some of his business partners there in Dallas, he funded another 5,000 to go down and graze these lands. And, of course, this is the mid-1870s, and if you'll remember our story about Miss Mabel Doss Lee, the fencing hadn't really started until the 1880s, so there were no real fenced-in areas at this time, and the cattle business was absolutely booming. And in the book that I will allude to quite a bit throughout this, which is The Rise and Fall of the Lazy S Ranch by Murrah, here's what he had to say in one of the first chapters that kind of prefaces what was going on at this time. It said, according to J. Evetts Haley, who of course wrote the biography of Charles Goodnight, in no section of the world has the pastoral pursuit of cattle raising flared to a more magnificent scale than here. When the Prairie and Hansford Cattle Companies, the J.A.'s, the Matadors, the American Pastoral Company, and others were cornering staggering amounts of land and counting their cattle by the tens of thousands, it was the day of the enthusiastic appraisal, of book count, of hasty investments and leisurely repentance. The beef bonanza in Texas was driven in large part by the relatively sudden availability in the 1870s of cheap land in the Panhandle. Up until 1876, Texas had set aside much of its public domain to the then existing counties for support of their public schools and other tracts for the University of Texas and other institutions such as the schools for the blind and the deaf. But under New Texas Constitution of 1876, the state revived the practice of providing grants, which were up to 16 sections per mile, of new railroad construction. And as a result, by 1883, the state had deeded away certificates to more than 27 million acres of land. It's quite fascinating, honestly, to hear how the new state constitution in Texas at that time was providing new hurdles and obstacles to folks that were utilizing the lands in West Texas. If you don't know much about Texas history, of course, we were under Reconstruction government after the Civil War, and a few different iterations of our Constitution occurred throughout the last half of the 18th century. And the 1876 Constitution was an intriguing one because of the emphasis on growth, on building institutions, like they said, for the schools, setting aside land for that, and also for the institutions like the School for the Blind and the Deaf, which are actually still active and have beautiful campuses in the Austin area. But this is not just a statement of fact, but the Constitution essentially is another character in the play that we are talking about today with the establishment of the ranch, because it is the new obstacle or hurdle that Slaughter is going to have to overcome in building his ranch. And inputs such as land began to skyrocket at this time. I love how Haley described it as the investments were done leisurely and without repentance, which means therefore there was not a lot of care or careful consideration going into these things, which honestly reminds me of the Central Texas region today. Land prices here are absolutely skyrocketing, and it's from investments from people that view this land as cheap. I mean, property values have increased tenfold in some areas for raw land, and home values have doubled. It's absolutely fascinating, but if you think about that, it will remind you that why people like Slaughter wanted to invest so much in purchasing this land, because of course land is one of the few inputs that rarely ever has a recession or loses value, and especially over long term will continue to appreciate. So when Slaughter was faced with this initial issue of what are you going to do when people move into the area where you've been ranching, he decided he was going to utilize his significant capital and resources to go where other people couldn't. And those were the lands of the central West Texas, such as the Llano Estacado, because there was not enough water to make life of any sort, farming, ranching, settlements. We really hadn't discovered oil at this time. There was no use for it, and therefore there was no real use for this land, and therefore Slaughter was able to buy it up, and he figured what he could do was raise a series of windmill-powered wells across the landscape and would be able to make a profit out of these underutilized lands. So he's going to make the capital investment, the hopefully one-time major capital investment with smaller maintenance fees for drilling the wells and operating them via the wind. And if you have ever been to West Texas, of course, you'll know the wind blows quite a bit, and so there's a lot of power out there and a lot of opportunity to pull up water. But if he made that investment, then he could buy the cheaper lands and more lands that were in a unified area, and he could build this empirical ranch that he had always wanted. And here's where another interesting character plays into the story. The section of the Panhandle on down into West Texas that he had been eyeing for this expansion was actually going to become another famous ranch that I will cover in a future episode, which is the XIT Ranch. If you don't know the story of the XIT, I look forward to telling it, but as a brief refresher, it was actually the product of a deal between the state of Texas and a Chicago firm that they were going to deed 3 million acres in the Texas Panhandle in exchange for the construction of a new Texas capital in 1882. So obviously Texas did not have a ton of money, especially after the Civil War, but they were a land-rich state, and they figured that they could give away 3 million acres to this firm to build the capital, and in exchange the firm would build this absolutely magnificent and mighty ranch. And this was going to actually play to Slaughter's advantage, because he knew that with an operation of that size in the area, that there would soon be rail lines, because there's going to be a need to ship off cattle, there's going to be a need to bring in folks to work, to get goods and services in and out. And so he knew that the Llano Estacado on up into the Panhandle would be a great place for him to set up his new shop. And, this was an interesting, I wouldn't say gamble, but it certainly wasn't the easiest strategy he would ever have. And interestingly enough, here's what Murrah was pointed out was going to be the new problem for the colonel. He said, by 1881, nearly all of Lubbock, Terry, and Yoakum counties had been surveyed by railroads or their surveyors. With the removal of the XIT's 3 million acres from the public domain, only about 1.2 million acres of unassigned lands were left in the Panhandle Plains area. Most of this land, which had been passed over by the Capitol Reserve Inspection Report, lay in Hockley, Cochran, and Bailey counties. When the Texas legislature met in 1881, it realized that much of the public domain was gone, but it had not set aside land for the yet-to-be-organized counties in Texas, many of which, of course, laid in the Panhandle. That prescribed need led to the last magnanimous land giveaway by the state. In March 1881, the legislature set aside 3 100-acre leagues of about 1.2 million acres to provide for designating and setting apart 300 leagues of land out of the unappropriated public domain for the benefit of the unorganized counties of the state. As a result, within a 2-year period, the legislature deeded away over 4 million acres of its remaining public domain. Surveyors soon headed to the vacant land of the western Llano, but they discovered that some of the older Texas counties had already claimed some of it. As a result, the legislature in 1883 amended the 1881 Act and added an additional 25 leagues to the organization to ensure that every qualified county, unorganized or organized, would receive a designated block of 4 leagues, which is around 17,712 acres. The legislation and resulting transfer of the title to individual counties, at least in the short run, shaped the immediate future of the western Llano. In nearly all of Cochran County and a large part of Bailey County, 50 separate counties received 4 leagues each, and several more acquired smaller blocks. Each county was to hold the 4-league block of land until it needed to sell it to support its public schools. So I'm going to cut in here. You're starting to see why this problem is going to exist, because initially the only person that you had to buy this land from was either the person who owned it, the state, or the county within which it resided. So Slaughter was buying these pieces of property from a few of the railroads and a few of the folks who had lived there before, or just running cattle and grazing on them until leases became necessary. But now, every county in Texas, and if you don't know, there's over 250 counties in Texas, was now going to get rights to this property. And what that meant was you were going to have to deal with the different buyers, the different sellers of this property, and have to wait until they needed it for their schools. And, it was not going to be a cheap process. So furthermore, Murrah says, what is significant is that each county owned a large pasture, which was generally 2.5 miles wide and 10 miles long, all contiguous. This arrangement contrasted with the other surveys that had done the checkerboard pattern across West Texas. That is, the state would retain every other section for homesteading and gave the alternate sections to the railroad. Therefore, while ranchers would conceivably buy the railroad land, they had no assurance that they could keep someone else from homesteading on and buying the state sections. But in these counties, Cochran County, Hockley County, and Bailey counties, ranchers would be able to lease or even buy the entirety of the large 4-league contiguous pastures. In essence, on the western Llano, the future belonged to those who could afford to control this large acreage, which in turn would effectively shut out the advancing farmers' frontier for the next 40 years. So as I was saying when I cut in, this property was now going to be in major sections. if you haven't looked up checkerboarding, which was a practice at this time, it was absolutely fascinating, because what would happen was the state would give property along a railroad to the railroad company, and then a section on each side, and that was how they were going to fund the railroad. And instead of doing just one major section along the railroad, they would checkerboard it. So you would have one league, and then next door they would give that to the state, would keep that for homesteading. And so what Murrah was describing is that with these new apportionments of land, while it would be difficult to purchase them because of the fact that these were different counties selling at different times for different needs, these would be major sections of contiguous property, which is what our slaughter and other ranchers would want, to be able to drive cattle in the area. And while the state was figuring out different ways to apportion their lands in the West, Slaughter was continuing to build his brand. In fact, he had established the Long S Ranch and was becoming the major cattle supplier to the XIT. So again, he had seen that there was value in this major 3 million acre ranch coming into town, and he knew that they were going to need inputs. And so by 1886, he had actually sold 10,000 head to them, which was, of course, quite the payday for old Slaughter. And that was going to help him continue to build up his own fortune, his own ranch lands, and combat the progress or the advancement of the small town or small time farmer, and everything else that was coming west. The ranch was no longer as open the range was no longer as open as it once was. As I mentioned many a times, of course, we kind of set that 1881 through 1885 era as the time of the barbed wire. And so if you'll think back to both the 1883 series and also Mabel Doss Lee, it was time to start settling down. If you were a cattle rancher, you were going to have to find your major piece of land, and you were going to have to begin to protect it and section it off, because there was no more driving cattle on long, open, beautiful ranges. You had to have an operation in place. And of course, as I've already stated, the state was finding all types of ways to limit this further. And, if you are the state, you want as many people paying taxes, producing on the land, making the land more valuable so that the taxing values go up, especially in a state like Texas that even to this day has no income tax. Your true taxation value comes from the productivity of your land. So one such law that they put into place to encourage this was known as the Four-Section Act, and it was similar to actually the Homesteading Act that Ellen Watson, known as Cattle Kate in one of my previous episodes, had utilized in Wyoming. And so essentially, this is what the Stock Growers Association in Wyoming was also exploiting when they would have their movable cabins, because what you had to do was you could put an $80 note or $80 on a 40-year note for a section of land. And that was a very, very small amount, especially over a 40-year period at that time. This made it very affordable to small town folks to move into the area and hopefully make the land productive and become, of course, tax-paying citizens. So Slaughter and his business partners tried to find a few different ways to circumvent the law. They did not do the movable cabins. They were not, that shady. They weren't trying to hoodwink the government, but they did figure out ways to utilize their cow hands and ranch hands to lease these lands and also settle claims on them. So essentially what would happen is one of your cowboys would go in and establish a homestead and work there, and essentially as long as he worked for you and you kept him happy, then the colonel could utilize his land. So the first thing that the colonel did was try and buy land from ranchers, but also these homesteaders, which of course was really hard to do. So he actually changed over to leasing them. And one of the biggest examples, though, of ranches that he bought was the 86,000 acre Running Water Ranch, which just laid in a few counties on the eastern edge of the XIT. So he bought that in 1890, and the Borden and Dawson County based TJF Ranch, which was 64,000 acres, he bought the following year. And then on top of that, he started leasing 140,000 acres, which was known as the Tahoka Lake Ranch. But of course, the problem with these lands is that although he bought, some of them and leased others, a lot of the lands within these were actually state leased lands. So even though you buy a ranch and it's got, 64,000 or 140,000 acres, all you're doing is buying the rights to some of those pastures, and it's not a long-term solution. It's eventually going to be turned over. The homesteaders are going to move in, and, you've got to find a way to consolidate and establish your right to ownership of these lands if you're someone like Slaughter at this time. So if you'll remember back to the episode I did on Charles Goodnight, he used his power with the southwestern cattle raisers to strong arm some folks into selling him their land, and that's essentially what eventually became the Goodnight Ranch. Of course, he had worked with J.A. to found the J.A. Ranch, John Adair, but near the end of his life, he wanted a ranch, and that's where the Kittiquay Ranch came from. But Slaughter had kind of a different strategy than Goodnight. What he would do is he would send his ranch hands not only to get the homesteads, but also into the county courthouse to renew the leases on other state lands under their names, and he would also in turn intimidate the newcomers from trying to take the land under the new law. Of course, this didn't always work, and it was a temporary solution. Like I said, if the ranch hand moved on, he might become a competitor or sell to somebody else or give the land back to the states by not renewing the lease. There are all kinds of issues, so this was just another temporary fix that the colonel had. So, of course, the question now is, what was the colonel going to do? He wanted the empire, right? He wanted to build something that would stand the test of time. Think the King Ranch, the Four Sixes, the Matador, the Wagoner Ranch, all these places that existed for a long time, and some of them still exist to this day. He wanted that for himself. And it reminds you that this wasn't just about the money. If he wanted to do that, he could have stuck to his banking fortune in Dallas and continued to make it bigger, because of course, as we all know, banking fortunes rarely fail, and even if they do, they get bailed out. So if it was just about the money and building a trust, an irrevocable trust, something that could be established for his family to live on, then he could have just stuck to doing that in Dallas. But he wanted to make it in the cattle business. He wanted to have a ranch, a piece of property, something tangible. And he knew that leasing lands from the state just wasn't going to cut it, because it was too much of a temporary solution. So what was he going to do? That's the question that Murrah talks about on page 32 of his book, when he says that what the colonel was going to have to do was shift his plan. And here's exactly what he says. After the passage of the Four-Section Act in 1895, the four-league tracts in Cochran and Hockley counties became a more attractive prize for the cattlemen being displaced by the homesteaders. As previously mentioned, the St. Louis Cattle Company was using much of Cochran County after taking control from John Beal's Jumbo Ranch. Then, during the spring of 1897, R.S. Farrell leased 43,000 acres in northeastern Cochran County, apparently intending to stock that range, which was located just to the west of Fount Oxsheer's Diamond Ranch. But in May, Farrell actually sold his leases to M.B. Hewling of the Reeves County Ranch, a financial backer of Fount Oxsheer. Hewling then bought additional land and in turn leased the entire block to Fount Oxsheer. By mid-1897, the Hewling Ranch was in operation as Cochran County's largest at 93,000 acres. So just to pause there, I know it's a lot of complex land dealings that I just read in one paragraph, but essentially we have this character, Fount Oxsheer, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute, but he was a close ally, previously a competitor, but became an ally of the Colonel, and he essentially consolidated many of the lands in Cochran and Hockley counties which hadn't really been affected by the four-league issue. And so essentially between 1895 and the turn of the century, they had established 93,000 acres worth of ranching in Cochran County under Oxsheer. So Murrah goes on to say, by the end of 1897, Slaughter was tired of paying rent to pasture his cattle, and with an improving cattle market, he made what he knew would be one of the biggest decisions of his life. With Oxsheer's apparent encouragement and offer to help, Slaughter decided to try and buy up 350,000 acres in a solid block by obtaining Oxsheer's and Hewling's ranches as well as the county-owned school lands in Hockley and Cochran counties. To accomplish the task, Slaughter hired Oxsheer in December of 1897 to buy the land and agreed to pay him bonuses for deeds for 50 to 60 leagues, or about 250,000 acres in one block. In a January 1898 letter to his son George, Slaughter expressed his optimism about his motive for the venture. I am still pulling away on the land trade you heard Oxsheer and I figuring on. I now have $6,000 on the proposition. He thinks I will finally get the 350,000 acres. I am of the opinion that it is one of the best ranches in the state that can be obtained in a solid body. The fact is, it is about the last chance. If I succeed in getting this ranch and live long enough to improve it right, I desire to make it an insurance policy for my children, undivided and indivisible, until the death of the last one of my family. I think it is the best policy I could leave my children, as it will be yielding a profit all the time. It will be one of, if not the greatest legacy ever left to a family in the nation. It will be the greatest blood preserve on earth, and I am trying to leave a sterling character to go with it, as I think a good name is the most priceless heritage a man can leave. And there you have it. There is Slaughter's ultimatum, his goal in life, spelled out to his son George in this letter. He just lays it all out. This is what he wants, and he's going to use Oxsheer and whoever else he needs to get it. And I think that's a very interesting passage. Like I said, you should buy this book, read the letters. It's absolutely fascinating, and you learn so much about this man through this book. Now have what I would call his motive. So the Colonel's plan may have shifted, but he now would own the land that he wanted to establish what would become the Lazy S Ranch. $93,000 acres were now securely in the Colonel's hands. But as I told you at the beginning, of course, you might be thinking, didn't you say there were 250,000 acres on the Lazy S Ranch? And that's where the next part of this story comes in. from there on out, Slaughter utilized Oxsheer as his main buyer and his son George to go out and try and buy land from surrounding counties on down even close to the border. And these efforts were overall very successful. But of course, what would happen was that Oxsheer would utilize a network of people not affiliated with the Slaughter brand to try and buy these lands. And some of the counties actually didn't really take too kindly to that deception, if you will. One of the counties was Coke County, which is actually just north of San Angelo, Texas. And they were actually successful in getting their land back after a 2-year legal battle, which is quite fascinating because essentially what happened was that someone, a proxy or an agent, bought the land for Slaughter and then, of course, immediately sold it to him. And when that happened, Coke County said that it had been sold under deceptive, under the guise of someone else using it. And they really didn't want someone that already had 93,000 acres buying any more land in their county. And another county, Brewster County, which actually is the county that encompasses Alpine, Texas, all the way down to Big Bend. So think about the border on the Rio Grande. They tried as well to get some of their land back, but the courts did not rule in their favor. And there were some other counties that had tried this as well, but that's just a pretty interesting little section of, just how close to the edge of legality a lot of this was, and how the perception of these ranchers at this time was not too positive. It's always impressive to think about building a ranch of this size, and we understand his motives, but of course, a lot of people start to wonder why somebody needs that much land. Kind of reminds me of that scene in Yellowstone when John Dutton, the main character, Kevin Costner's character, comes across the tourists that are in his field where there's the bear, and the one man who I believe he's from China tells him that this is not, this is too much land for one man. And, Dutton, of course, says that this is America and you can have as much land as you want. And I think, even many Americans sometimes question that idea. And that's where as I spoke last time, there's always a little bit of tension, if you will, between how laws can be used to promote American dreams, but also sometimes temper or stop an American dream from growing out of control and infringing on others. So, if you want a full breakdown of the acreages that are purchased and how they were procured, of course, I would highly recommend that you pick up Murrah's book. It's a very good read, and I know I've said it a million times, but if if you're someone who enjoys this type of stuff, books like this that come out of the series through Texas A&M's press about ranching heritage are fantastic. And, I also believe that if I were to read all these off, it would be a lot like reading the book of Numbers in the Bible, very soporific. I don't want to bore you to sleep on this podcast with all the numbers, but of course, if you're trying to take a $93,000 or 93,000 acre ranch and turn it into a 250,000 acre ranch, there's a lot of business dealings that are going to go on there, and it's a very interesting story to read. But I will read you a small little summary from Murrah, which is on page 39. He actually has a great graphic on page 38 that shows the Slaughter and the next door neighbor, which was the Mallet Ranch, in the year 1903. But essentially what he said was that for all of this land, the colonel had paid approximately $240,000 to the counties and $95,000 in bonuses to Oxsheer and his agents for a total of essentially $1.36 per acre. Within a 2-year period, Oxsheer and his agents had created a vast new ranch during an era when other ranches were breaking up. Their relatively swift work and stealth ensured the accomplishment, and as most of the property was obtained before the commissioners realized that their purchasers were only agents. Indeed, some of the counties recognized what Slaughter had acquired, and 2 of them refused to accept early payoffs on land notes in order to earn the 6% interest payments. So, as I mentioned earlier, some counties didn't take too kindly to this, and some of them fought him in court, and others would just decline payments so that they could milk as much money as possible out of him, because, of course, the interest payments on a 40-year note at $80 for certain pieces of land when paid off by a small-time farmer is a pretty good deal at 6%, whereas if Slaughter came in, he could pay you in cash up front, and unlike most people operating a cap. Well, one of the people that the Colonel was, of course, going to rely on was this character that you've heard a little bit about but don't know the story to yet, which is Fount Oxsheer. And here's a little bit of a background on him. He was actually born Fount Oxsheer, the son of William W. Oxsheer in Milam County, which is in central to eastern Texas, kind of northeast of Austin area, on November 9th, 1849. And he actually was a cattle driver throughout the Civil War and afterwards. And in 1880, he became a rancher and businessman that in the area of central Texas, there's this town called Calvert. I've driven through it hundreds of times since I went to Texas A&M and on my way home. And he's credited with stamping out the rampant lawlessness there and establishing the first semblance of law and order. But in 1884, he moved west to Colorado City with his wife, and from there helped form the Jumbo Cattle Company with his in-laws, and established ranches of his own on the Llano Estacado. In the 1890s, of course, him and Slaughter would amass land on the Oxsheer ranches for the largest herd of registered Hereford cattle in the United States. So that's a little bit of information on Fount Oxsheer. And he would become the most trusted advisor that Slaughter had outside of his family. Now, of course, his oldest son, George, was the natural choice, and he became, the number one confidant, if you will, for the Colonel. He also hired a young man named Hiley T. Boyd, who was an experienced cattleman, and he was only around 35 years old in 1889 when Slaughter hired him, but he would essentially be the man who lived on and operated the Lazy S Ranch. And he would be in charge of around 10 to 20 men who would manage the herds and maintain the windmills and other structures on the property, and of course, had to have a cook as well. So this was kind of Slaughter's cabal. He was getting older in age. He was born in the 1830s, so by the turn of the century, of course, 70 years old, and 70 at this time was definitely not a young man. One of the interesting things about Slaughter at this time is that, of course, as an old man, he traveled to the ranches at least once or twice a year, and he had actually outfitted an old army medical wagon that was pulled by 2 mules with a bed and a cooktop and all kinds of things for his journeys from Dallas out west to the ranches. And as I described at the beginning of the episode, this would be more than a day's ride, more than a few days' ride. For someone his age, it was absolutely fascinating that he would make these journeys, but he was riding in as much comfort as you could at that time until the railroads came out there. And I think back to the series by Robert Caro about LBJ. He talks about Coke Stevenson, who was the governor of Texas, who ran against LBJ for Senate in the 1950s. And Coke was born in the 1800s and had actually taken similar trips as a young man from Junction, which is near Kerrville in the San Antonio area, on up towards Lubbock in a horse and mule pulled wagon, delivering goods from one city to another. And I mean, you just have to think about, Stevenson at this time was a young man doing this, but Slaughter was definitely not young, and making a journey like this when there was no way to get help. Obviously he would travel with folks like his children or other people, but really a crazy liability to have someone of his age out on a trip of this nature at this time. But he would visit the camps. There were all kinds of line camps that were established, and the plan was actually to run around 20,000 head on this arid land. So what he did was he input a investment just north of about $50,000 to erect it was about 40 to 45 windmills at 24 locations that would provide enough water for these massive herds. And interestingly enough, some of those locations would have 2 windmills. A few of them had 3, and they would generate quite a bit of power to pull off enough water for these herds. And you'll learn more here in a minute, but Slaughter's herds were not hurting. They were not malnourished. They did not have issues with putting on weight, and it's very successful considering the land, the inputs, if you will, that he had in this area of Texas. So the line camps were established, and essentially what they would do is that a cowboy would bring his family, and they would assign each one that had a family to manage the line camp, manage that area. So the wife would, of course, cook for the folks, and the cowboy would maintain everything in the area, including they sometimes had dugout structures for them to live in, but also different homes and various, fencing, all these things that would occur in their section they were in charge of. And in just a few short years, it looked like everything was going according to plan. The Colonel sold a few thousand head in 1902 with an average weight of 1,600 pounds, which is pretty good for today's, genetically engineered animals that we have, ones that have fantastic bloodlines and have been, bred for years for certain traits. But at this time, 1,600 was an absolute record-breaking number, and he was bringing in a mid-5-figure profit. So at that time, of course, 5-figure, we're getting tens of thousands of dollars, would be considered today closer to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, depending on how high that would go. But the better part was that the inputs were actually decreasing in cost. There was some economic issues that were occurring, and so land was actually getting cheaper in the areas. There was no more Bonanza. A lot of the smaller time cattle herders have been crowded out, if you will, and he thought that this was the success he wanted, and he thought everything was going to plan. And so in 1902, he incorporated the ranch and divided its stock equally amongst his heirs, which at that time were, of course, his wife and his 9 living children. We'll get more into the information about his family, but what happens there. I've got a great little family tree that I'll provide to y'all in the next episode, because it'll become very important to try and keep all these figures straight in your mind as we talk about what happens after the Colonel gives up power to his heirs. But the preamble of the corporate filings are really interesting, and Murrah actually lists them in the book, so I'm going to read from there on page 55. It says, "Having been blessed with my success in business, I have, for several years, thoughtfully considered the feasibility of setting apart a certain portion of my estate as an indivisible," and Murrah says that this is an author's emphasis, "an indivisible endowment for my wife and children, all the fruits of which shall be enjoyed equally by them so long as the last one of them shall survive. It is my emphatic injunction, expressed desire, and unconditional mandate that the title to the shares of the corporation shall not pass from my wife, Carrie Averill Slaughter, and my children, or at the death of them, or either of them from their natural heirs, so long as one of my children shall survive. So, it's a beautiful, beautiful piece, and kind of a stern piece, saying this is for all of you all. It's indivisible. It's a emphasized word in this, indivisible. But it's a work of love, and he was a proud father, and I wish we could end the story there, or even say that it ended happily ever after with a few more details. But unfortunately, this story is far, far, far from over. Well, folks, there you have it. The Colonel has built his empire. He's got his 200,000 plus acre ranch in West Texas. His family's the board of directors. It's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in today's money is of course millions. And everything seems to be going good. He's selling cattle. He's selling them at record profits. And what could go wrong? I mean, land never goes down in value, right? The demand for beef is going up. Well, unfortunately, this isn't the end of the story, but it is the end of today's episode. I want to thank you again, of course, for coming. And until next time, of course, Godspeed and God bless. Thank you.